Of course, white women, 52% for Donald Trump, and then you have 47% for Kamala Harris. Now, Donald Trump, according to Pew, received 53% of the vote from white women in 2020. So basically, he didn't lose hardly any white women, despite the Dobbs decision overturning Roe.
White women. Ooh. Oh, white women. I need for y'all to remember who you are.
Simba, you have forgotten me.
No. How could I?
You have forgotten who you are, and so forgotten me. Look inside yourself, Simba. You are more than what you have become. You must take your place in the circle of life.
How can I go back? I'm not who I used to be.
Remember who you are.
And before y'all get on my head, I'm not out here caping for white women, but I need for them to realize that what's about to happen could have been avoided if they would have realized their true power. My people, hello and welcome to Z's Takes. Nothing hot or cold, just my takes on life, pop culture, music, history, and more. If you don't mind, please like, comment, subscribe, and if you don't, tell me why. It's engagement either way. So Trump won, and the dystopian plot thickens. White women have thrown the stones of betrayal and are trying to hide their hand. Girl, them crocodile tears ain't working for me or nobody else, and I'm gonna need y'all to grow the up. As me and my partner were walking past the American Prohibition Museum in Savannah, Georgia, my partner made the point that the power of white women organizing has literally changed the face of our nation. Not to give them too much credit, but let's just be real. The privilege of being a white woman in this nation, in this world, comes with a status that has never been afforded to other groups of women. In this video, I will talk about how two historical instances in which white women have organized and made significant changes in this country, and what could happen if they would just tap into the power of their own ancestors and do good for all, and not just some. Prohibition and the temperance movement. White women led the charge of the temperance movement of the 19th and early 20th century. Yes, there were Black and other women of color who were a part and participated in this movement, like Sojourner Truth, Hattie Purvis, and Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. However, the pervasive nature of racism and classism kept Black women and other women of color from the mainstream narrative of the temperance movement in the Prohibition era. With that being said, white women used their collective power, status, imagery, and connections with the Presbyterian Church and other organizations to literally change the law of the land. These women came together and in 1874 founded the Women's Christian Temperance Union, or WTCU. This organization was women-led and initially took the charge of eradicating alcohol consumption, for these women were often brutalized, neglected, and financially imprisoned by their alcoholic husbands and fathers. These women held peaceful protests, passed out pamphlets, lobbied in local and state governments, and traveled all over the country to promote alcohol moderation. This group was founded on the principle of having a pure and sober world, using Christianity as its foundation. And by 1890, its second president, Frances Willard, was leading the largest organization of women in the world. The WTCU had also began anti-tobacco campaigns, lobbied for local laws restricting alcohol, and created an anti-alcohol educational campaign that reached nearly every schoolroom in the nation. The organizing power of these women began to shift the atmosphere, and the systemic influence of upper class, middle class white women purity gave the later organization, the Anti-Saloons League, or ASL, the power they needed to bolster support for a national amendment for prohibition. After the passage of the 19th Amendment, feminists went after the big boss, full equality, and this would be achieved through the Equal Rights Amendment, or the ERA, introduced in 1923 by Alice Paul and Crystal Eastman as the amendment that would guarantee equal legal rights for all American citizens, regardless of sex. Proponents asserted that it would end legal distinctions between men and women in matters such as divorce, property, and employment. In other words, women would have full autonomy under the protection of the law. Despite the ideological and class rift between feminists, the ERA as it was presented was pushed and regarded as the next best thing for all women. So from 1921 until about 1982, feminist groups of mostly domestic women, middle class and upper class white women lobbied, fundraised, and hosted protests and meetings to gather support for the proposed amendment. The amendment went through some revisions, and by revisions I mean one sentence was added. The provisions of this article shall not be construed to impair any rights, benefits, or exemptions now or hereafter conferred by law upon the persons of the female sex. And in 1950 and 1953, after years of congressional blockage, it was finally passed by the Senate. However, this version of the ERA was not what the original supporters wanted, and it was still facing backlash as labor feminists called for more protections for the recent victories that they had won for women workers and saw the ERA as an amendment for middle-class housewives and not working-class women. The calls for labor protections continued to sideline the ERA, even though it had the support of Congress and a couple of presidents. As the century progressed, the ERA was losing support at an alarming rate. Even Kennedy's Assistant Secretary of State, Esther Peterson, rejected the amendment because of the lack of provisions for working class women. Feminists were able to secure a few wins with the Equal Pay Act and the Civil Rights Act, but the lack of government enforcement inspired Betty Friedan, in 1966 to form the National Organization of Women, or NOW, to serve, not my words, but hers, the NAACP for women. Now again, when a specific group of women can come together en masse and cause disruption and use their collective power and image, things happen. NOW's membership grew by the hundreds, and in the late 60s into the 70s and 80s, they hosted strikes, boycotts, lobbied for the inclusion of women's studies courses in major colleges, sponsored a presidential candidate with Shirley Chisholm, and organized national campaigns for Title IX and Roe v. Wade. They even held a national march for over hundreds of thousands of women showed up in Washington, D.C. from all backgrounds to push for the passage of the ERA. These women, these white, upper crust, middle class housewives organized and they organized and they organized and they made shifts for the 20th century that we now can kind of still feel today. And again, not to give them too much credit because they did have support from Black, POC, and working class women, but the underlying point is this. The presence of a specific type of white woman pushed the needle towards women's liberation. If the ERA was headed by someone like Shirley Chisholm or Pauli Murray instead of Betty Friedan, the conversation and reach would have been different, just from a numbers standpoint. In 1970, there were about 89 million white women to 11.3 Black women. Fast forward to the 80s, you got 94 million white women to 13 million Black women. And when we're talking about resources, money, education, and most importantly, time, white women had more access to this than Black women. So while NOW did have the support and help from Black women and other marginalized groups of women, its existence and mission would not have been compromised if we weren't present. But just as they thought that the ERA was foolproof and ready to be added, another housewife entered the chat.
Our system, in case of the breakup of marriage, the mother gets her children in most cases. Now, who wants to trade that in for a so-called equality, whereby each parent gets one child?
Well, I don't think the Equal Rights Amendment says that either,
yes.
that in case of a divorce, each parent gets one child.
It says that you've got to interpret things absolutely equally. Now, take another point is the draft. Everybody admits that the Equal Rights Amendment will make women subject to the draft. There's no dispute about this. This is admitted in all the hearings and debate and testimony. And it's beyond me why women should agitate to be drafted.
But
if they want to be drafted, they could go volunteer. But why do they want to take the right from the rest of women away so that we are subject to the draft?
According to Jane Mansbridge, the amendment would have been ratified by 1975 or 76 had it not been for Phyllis Schlafly's early and effective efforts to organize potential opponents. Another well-to-do, college-educated, all-American white woman destroyed any chance of the ERA passing. Like her liberal counterparts, Phyllis Schlafly used gender roles, conservatism, religion, and other arguments to vilify the ERA. Her Stop ERA campaign used talking points such as the ERA would take away gender-specific privileges enjoyed by women, including the dependent wife benefit under Social Security, separate bathrooms for male and females, an exemption from selective service, i.e. the military draft. The ERA would grant women universal abortion rights and give homosexuals the right to marry. She pulled every bigoted rabbit out of the hat and built a campaign of supporters that included other white women. Although the Stop ERA campaign supporters were much smaller than that of the National Organization of Women, Shafley had the support of major organizations such as the John Birch Society, the AFL-CIO, and the National Council of Catholic Women. But how? How did this one woman dismantle and disrupt a 50-year movement in less than a decade? She weaponized her whiteness. The one-dimensionalism of white womanhood, she leaned in heavy on her socialized role as a mother, housemaker, and wife. She drowned it in American exceptionalism and Christian nationalism, making it intoxicating to the powers that be, letting them know that her and other women that look like her would stay beside her and uphold this system to protect this idea and illusionary freedom of the white woman experience. So Karen, don't ask me for shit. Fast forward to 2024, Kamala Harris loses to Donald Trump and 53% of white women voted for Trump in comparison to 45% for Harris. Y'all did it again and at a much higher rate. White women, my only question is why? Why would you insist on voting for a party that has shown you time and time again that you do not matter? Your body is their property, and the very rights that your mothers, grandmothers, and aunts fought for are now having to be fought for again. In my honest opinion, and after looking at the history, I've come to the conclusion that you do not value yourself. And like some black men, you have not defined yourself for yourself. A majority of you are still stuck in this idea of what you should be. Your suicidal attachment to whiteness and thus to power has done more harm to you than anything that Trump, DeSantis, Abbott, or any man could do to you. I assume you feel like you are all alone in this world, and if you leave this captivity that you think to be protection and love, that you will not survive. This country was not built with you in mind. Your ancestors were brought over here as property and baby makers. You are not as free as you think. You are one leg removed from falling from the table, and men like Trump will be okay with feeding you crumbs. White women, for the next 4 years, I don't need to hear you singing no Lauryn Hill or shaking that pancake of an ass to no Beyonce or Lizzo. I want you to ask yourself, why do we keep doing this to ourselves? I don't want to hear about your marriages, your problems with your labradoodle. I don't want to hear none of your shit unless it's, I got this, I'm sorry, and it's time for us to make this right. And lastly, don't ask black women, POC women, for shit. Well, this has been Z's Takes. Don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe. Make sure you join the Patreon so we can keep this thing going. And I'll see y'all next time. Peace and blessings.